Hi, I am John Brittas. Today we are starting a new dialogue on development. The COVID-19 crisis has disrupted life everywhere. Kerala is starting a new platform to discuss and debate on development. Let me welcome you all to the Kerala Dialogue, a global conversation on development. The Honorable Chief Minister of Kerala, Shri Pinarayi Vijayan, will inaugurate this series. Once again, I welcome you all to this global conversation on development.
Humanity is in a battle with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic and the resultant crisis have made us all rethink about the core aspects of our life. We now know that we have to change for this new world. Our priorities are going to change. Even the way we organize our society may change. Some of the common knowledge that we take for granted might become useless. We may have to gain new knowledge to adapt. This is not something that governments alone can do. A society-wide conversation is necessary. We have to search, develop, discuss, and debate ideas and models through this conversation. Like many other occasions, Kerala will be a pathfinder in this quest also. We are starting a platform called Kerala Dialogue to facilitate this global conversation. Scientists, philosophers, policymakers, economists, activists, representatives, professionals, and the general public will be part of this conversation. In times of a crisis like COVID-19, the relationship between the state and the people needs to be strong, trustworthy, and organic. Kerala's experience with this crisis has many lessons to offer. Historically, Kerala has had a very strong system of decentralized governance. The attempts to build and strengthen the grassroots level democracy in the state precede the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments. Legislative efforts in this regard started as early as 1957, when the state elected its first communist government led by E.M.S. Namboodiripad. Kerala made pioneering strides in the decentralized form of governance, including implementation of the People's Plan program. As a result, there is considerable community participation in the planning process, which has enriched the process of decentralization of power. It is this strong system of participatory governance that has helped Kerala in the containment measures related to the COVID-19 pandemic. A state or a central government can give broad directions and guidelines, but people's participation under the leadership of empowered local governments seems to be the most effective strategy to contain the spread of COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, a strong public sector in health and education is necessary for this decentralized model to work well. The COVID-19 pandemic has also made us rethink the role of state intervention, especially in social sectors like health. The experience of the pandemic should act as a game changer in assessing the role of the state. Public sector intervention in social and economic sectors cannot be treated as an avoidable evil. Borrowing by the state cannot always be a vice. We now know that economic and social inequalities tend to make the problems of pandemic worse. The crisis has disproportionately affected the marginalized and poor communities. We need to bring the focus back onto the people. I hope this conversation will further advance our understanding about the world the role of governance, and the best models for our societies. I welcome you all to this conversation.
Is it correct to talk in terms of a post-COVID-19 world? Does the pandemic represent a transformatory point?
Well, what's going to be a post-pandemic world depends on what people are doing right now. There are people, the ones with the power, the ones who created the neoliberal disaster, the ones who are benefiting from Trump's malice. They're working very hard, relentlessly, to try to ensure that the world that comes out from the pandemic will be structurally much like the one that caused it, even harsher, more authoritarian, more controls, more surveillance. They're working on it right now. Things like I mentioned, the deregulation, many other ways. There are counterforces all over the world, very significant ones. If they can be brought together and form a powerful force, they can change the way things will turn out. And there are steps in that direction. About 2 weeks ago, there was the first announcement of Progressive International. It's based on the Sanders movement in the United States, Yanis Varoufakis's DiEM25 in Europe, transnational organization in Europe seeking to preserve what makes sense in the European Union and overcome the deeply flawed parts of it. They're forming a progressive international, voices from all over the world, from India, Africa, Global South, United States, Europe. The Prime Minister of Iceland is a member, and the first meeting will be in Iceland in September. They're trying to create a different world. How will this conflict emerge? You can never predict, but it's going on right now. It'll intensify as there are the beginnings of decline of the pandemic. There will be recovery. We should bear in mind while we're talking about this, though, the crucial fact, we are ultimately going to recover from the pandemic at terrible cost. We will never recover from the melting of the polar ice sheets and other grim consequences of global warming, which are going to have a hideous effect on the world. South Asia will become uninhabitable in several more decades if we continue on our present course. And that's just the beginning. If we're not going to recover from that. And what are the governments of the world doing? Let's take a look. Some of them are doing something, including India. Not enough, but something. The country that's doing most is the most powerful country in the world. It's racing towards the abyss. Trump is pulling out all the stops to try to maximize the use of fossil fuels and to eliminate any regulatory apparatus that might mitigate them. And for a good reason. That enriches his rich friends and increases corporate power. And if it leads to the destruction of organized human life, it's not an issue. Even small, it takes Trump's tearing up the agreement with Iran. Why? Because Obama made the agreement, so he has to tear it up for his own ego. The effects are pretty serious. That's, quite apart from the horrible effects on Iran, it's sharply increasing the threat of major war in the region. Europe doesn't like it. Are they doing anything? No. They don't want you, when the U.S. imposes sanctions, it's the only country in the world that can do this. Everyone in the world has to obey the sanctions. They're third-party sanctions. So Europe doesn't want to be thrown out of the international financial system, and it doesn't want to anger the mafia don in Washington. So they make timid protests, and then they observe the sanctions and go along. Trump came out with what's called the greatest deal in history for the Middle East. If any other country had put that out, people wouldn't, if they'd even noticed, they'd be collapsing in ridicule. When Trump comes out with it, it's the law. Now we ask how we can implement it. Does it go too far, and so on. This is awesome power. No one else comes close, and no one else is going to come close. All the talk about China becoming a competing superpower, I think, is built on sand.
Amartya, what would you say COVID-19 has taught us about inequality in the world?
I think that's a very hard question, because the pandemic in itself doesn't come with lessons. It kills indiscriminately. We often see in the New York Times the banality repeated again and again, saying the COVID-19 doesn't respect class or color, that is black or white. Of course, it doesn't, and we didn't expect it. What makes that relevant is how the population reacts to it. What happened if you, and this it applies not only to pandemic, it applies to any crisis. So when in the 1940s, early 1940s, the British discovered that they didn't have as much food per capita as they had before. What they did was to try to ensure that through rationing and control prices, that everyone will have that. And suddenly what was a negative situation of food shortage turned into a positive situation of people having more food entitlement for those who were at the bottom of the ladder. And suddenly undernourishment disappeared. And that experience was applauded, understood, and there were great authors like R.G. Hammond, like Titmuss, who brought those lessons to the attention of the public to learn from it. Now, unfortunately, that didn't happen. For example, take the United States, in an area like Chicago, the blacks, the African Americans, maybe 30% of the population, but 70% of the deaths were from the community of blacks, from the African American.
You mean COVID?
From COVID. And then as a result, one has to say that there was no attempt of the egalitarian direction in which, for example, the British went in the 40s. The British experience is very interesting because the same period in which the Brits were suddenly being better fed than ever before is also the period in which the Bengal famine happened in India. And the British had no sympathy at all. Those who didn't have the means of buying food and were perishing in large way. In some ways, the perishing began in the 1942, before the famine, and then became bigger and bigger through the 43 until past October. So that you see two different attitudes of the same leadership like Churchill and Anner and Bevan. Anner and Bevan was dominant as far as Britain is concerned. but Churchill was dominant as far as India is concerned. I don't take the view, as some people do, that the famine is all the fault of one person, that underestimate what imperialism does. Imperialism manifests itself in many forms, and one of them is an utter lack of sympathy to another group of conquered people, as opposed to the dominant metropolitan population. So that happened at that time. And in some ways, America had the feature of looking a bit like an imperial country. The slaves may have been brought to America hundreds of years earlier, and yet that distinction between we and they remains. It may be at long last receiving some real resistance in public action connected with what's going on in America right now. And I see some hope in that. What we do and how we understand the problem makes a big difference. Every adversity, every dialectical challenge is potentially a learning experience. But it need not go that way if people refuse to learn.
What seems to be WHO's current reading of the situation, that you're not going to be able to eradicate the virus. You will have to manage around it. It's going to be with us for a long time, but you can do a lot to contain it, live with it. Perhaps the trajectory will be from pandemic to epidemic to endemic. Would you like to comment on that impression, Dr. Swaminathan?
The first thing I'd like to say is that we're learning a lot about this virus. And so each week we understand more and more, and therefore are thinking about it, and also the projections that we're able to make do change. And in fact, I think it's one of those things where in science it's very common, as you make advances, scientists do debate and question each other, and then that's how knowledge advances. But for the public, I think it's probably a new experience to have all of this debate happening out in the public domain. But it's very normal for science. Now, this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, belongs to a family of coronaviruses that we have known for a long time. And prior to this one, there are 6 other coronaviruses that actually infect humans. Bats and some other animals actually have hundreds of coronaviruses that infect them, that don't do any harm. And we think this also came from the bat. But what we know now about this virus is that firstly, it's much more infectious than the 2 other previous serious coronavirus infections we've seen. The SARS in 2002-03, and then the MERS, which was later during this past decade. Now, SARS was completely contained and disappeared, actually, because of the measures that were taken, and possibly because it was much less infectious and transmissible. Whereas MERS continues to cause episodic outbreaks, even though countries have learned how to deal with it and keep it at a low level. This virus we've seen has spread extremely quickly. It's spread around the world. It's now present in almost every country in the world. And of course, it's caused major outbreaks, leading to a significant amount of death and morbidity. It appears that this virus will stay with us because of the spread and the transmission that has occurred over the last few months. And we're still watching it. We're watching the genetic mutations. We're watching it to see how it's behaving. And so far, it's doing like any other coronavirus. It changes a little bit like all RNA viruses do. But the good thing is it hasn't changed its structure in those major domains at which drugs and vaccines are going to be targeted. So I think to sum up, it's likely that this virus will stay with us for a long time. It will have to be managed in one way or another. Right now, we're using these public health measures to contain it and to mitigate the damage. Hopefully, we will have a vaccine, which will definitely help building up immunity. And then just like humankind is now living with many, many viruses, perhaps this will become one more, but a manageable one.